based on your current podcast, who do you think listens to the show? And when I say that, I'm talking about we're making an avatar. We're going to name this person. We're going to get a picture of this person. How old are they? How much money do they make? Are they single, married, whatever? How often do they exercise? What are brands that they like? What are TV shows that they like? That is the level of work that I think is just super valuable. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. Today, for episode number 117, I think I'm doing the math right because there should have been Evan Carmichael and Evan Carmichael Part 2. Two things that helped our client monetize her podcast in her first week. Yes, in her first week. That is not clickbait. I don't think it's a stretch. That is the truth. So, if I've learned anything over the last 7 years of podcasting and the last 5 years of coaching podcasters, wow, that's wild, 5 years of coaching podcasters, there are two really big things that really make or break your podcast success. And it's not quality of audio, quality of video, episode titles, guests, it's none of that. The two big things are, number one, picking your niche, and number two, knowing your audience. We're going to get right into it. Let's just get right into it. I don't want to delay it. A lot of people ask me, how important is it for me to have my niche chosen? When you start the podcast, I don't think it's the most important because I would rather you get going and get comfortable and figure out where you would naturally flow to over time. So if you don't have a niche from the beginning, it's okay. Our niche for our podcast in the beginning was different than it is today. In the beginning, it was probably more self-awareness and philosophy when I started, and now it is education, self-improvement. It's different. Is it super different? No, but it's different. In the beginning, I would rather you start your podcast and get in front of the mic, and if you're doing the camera, if you're doing video, get in front of the camera, and just get your legs under you and just start talking. Because you'll naturally see how your progression is. You'll naturally see how your flow is. You'll figure out what you're pulled to talk about. You'll figure out what you don't want to talk about. And your niche can kind of develop. But it is the goal to have a niche eventually. Now, I'm going to say this, and I do not want anybody to get upset by this, and I'm not calling anybody out. The Joe Rogan method is not going to work for most people. I like to have cool conversations with cool people is not going to work for most people in terms of this being your full-time thing. Yes, you can grow a show that way, for sure. It's what I call the guest ladder. You start with a 40% quality guest, and then you get a 41 and a 42 and a 43 and a 44, and blah, blah, blah. You work your way up to having A-list guests. That's something you can do over time. That's what we were doing in the beginning. In the beginning, we started getting guests on, and then we would figure out how do we get a higher caliber of guest. And when I say higher caliber, I don't mean a higher caliber of human being necessarily. I don't mean somebody who's smarter or better at something. I mean from a perception perspective. This person is more well-known in the industry that we're in, right? Because that's ultimately, yes, you want the episode to be as valuable as humanly possible. But unfortunately, a lot of it is the follower game. Evan talked about that a little bit, where when we're trying to get guests on, some people only care about the amount of listens that you have. It can be the opposite as well, where if you're trying to attract people to your podcast, they only care about the number of followers that your guests have. So that's a very real thing. It is a very, very real thing. I think it's different than it's ever been, but that's still a thing. So why was I even talking about that? Oh, yeah, because that is the guest ladder. You can do that, and that's ultimately the way that you can make money, and that's something you can do down the line, right? And when I say ultimately you can make money, all I'm saying is eventually you grow the show, and you get new eyes, and you get new eyes, and you get new eyes, and then hopefully if you want to do a sponsorship, affiliate, ad model, you have the audience to do that, but that is definitely a hard road. So that's the guest ladder, and that's something that you can do. But a lot of people, when they're picking their niche, they are saying, my niche is I have cool conversations with cool people. And I think it's really hard to win with that. Because if we're just thinking about how many of those cool conversations with cool people are actually going to resonate with the majority of your audience? It's probably a small number. Now, if you're a really, really good world-class host who has a great personality, maybe that'll help. But I think it's a dangerous thing. I think it's a dangerous thing because you don't necessarily solve a problem, and it's harder for your audience to self-identify, right? So that's why I say that. I'm not trying to dissuade you from doing that. If that's what you want to do in order to get your foot into podcasting, I think it's worth trying. But I'm willing to bet that you're going to have to get super creative on how to make money with that if you want this to be your full-time thing. If this is a hobby for you and that's what fills your cup, hammer it. Awesome. Good for you. That makes me super happy that you love chatting with people and you love getting different perspectives and you want to give back to the world through those perspectives. I'm all for that. So this is really us talking about monetization more than anything. So that's my thought around that. It's very, very hard to have a podcast that is for everyone. One, in terms of making it successful, it's going to take a long time. Two, in terms of just making money with it. It's a really, really hard thing to do. And just don't fall into the trap of, well, the most successful shows are doing this. This is what I must do. No. Look at the most successful businesses. Are you going to build Amazon? Probably not. Maybe you want to. Awesome. But I'm a business owner, and we have goals of having a very large impact-based business, and we're not going to build an Amazon. We're going to do it in our own unique way. Maybe we'll take things from what they do, or Apple, or whatever, right? Whatever company that you're using in this mental example I'm giving, there's lessons that you can take from it, but it doesn't mean that you're trying to be them. But I think a lot of us are saying, I want to be the next Joe Rogan. I want to be the next Caller Daddy. I want to be the next this. It's not bad to aspire to, but they're just rare. They're just very, very, very rare. Yes, they're big and they're popular and they're famous, but for every one of those shows, there's 100,000 that you've never heard of. And I just don't want you to be that, if that's what you aspire to. All right, so knowing your niche. I think of a niche as a brand. Meaning, if I know your brand, I can kind of predict what you would talk about. So let's imagine, I don't know if Under Armour has a podcast, but let's imagine what Under Armour's podcast would be about. Most likely about performance, sports, athletes, probably some mindset stuff, but mostly athletes. Nike, same thing. You can imagine what the podcast that Nike has would be about, or at least what your expectations of that podcast would be about. Victoria's Secret. I don't know a ton about Victoria's Secret, but if they had a podcast, I'm sure it would be about, I'm guessing it would be about probably fashion and confidence and self-esteem and self-worth, that type of stuff, maybe sex, that type of stuff. If McDonald's had a podcast, you could probably imagine what it would be about. If Ford, the car company, had one, you can probably imagine what it would be about. If Red Bull had one, you can kind of imagine what it would be about. And many of these are probably out there. But just as an example, because that is their niche. Nike's niche is performance activewear for athletes. Under Armour's niche is similar, but they did it in a different way. Their niche was performance materials that are sweat wicking. That was their thing in the very beginning. McDonald's, fast service affordably. Less affordable now because things are expensive, right? But you can imagine how that would transition into a podcast. My podcast is about growing, scaling, and monetizing your podcast. All things podcasting. So you can imagine that I'm going to talk about branding and marketing and sales and communication and becoming a better speaker and how to make money. All of that stuff falls under that umbrella. One of the mistakes that I've been seeing a lot of people make lately is when I'm going on their podcast, I research their show, and their show is about whatever. Let's say it's about relationships, hypothetically. In my mind, I'm trying to prime my mind for a relationship conversation. And sometimes we won't even talk about that. I think that's a mistake. I went on a show recently that was about peak performance, and there were conversations around podcasting. I don't think that's where the conversation should have gone. Most of the audience does not care about podcasting. They're tuning in for peak performance. So that's a little bit of a loss of niche. That is a misalignment. That is super important for success. So this client did that really, really, really well. To why are we using the name and the words that we're going to use for the title of this podcast? Why are we using the name, and then why are we choosing the words that are going to be in the name? Because it speaks to the audience. Why are we dropping episodes at 5 o'clock in the morning on the day that it launches or the day that it drops? Because that's when her audience is up looking for podcasts. They're high performers. They're runners. I'm not going to give the name of this podcast just because I don't have permission to do it. I haven't asked. I could ask the host. I haven't yet. And I also want you to know that if you ever work with us, I'm not going to share your stats or anything. It's all anonymous. So I want to make sure that anonymity stays. But this person knows their audience at a very, 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 very deep level. They know what their audience would click on. They know what words their audience resonates with. They know whether their audience would rather jump on a free call or just jump to a paid call. They know because they've done the research and they've worked with them in the past, right? And obviously that's a thing that you might not have. Maybe you don't have experience with your audience, but we'll talk about that after. So picking your niche is one. And knowing your audience is number two. I just kind of segued those together. Picking your niche goes back to what are the top 25 to 50 problems that your audience has, and what are the top 25 to 50 problems that those problems create. And if you had a 10-word description of your podcast, what would it be? I don't have one for Podcast Growth U yet. I'll make one up at some point, right? I'll make one up. But I have a very clear understanding of what I want this podcast to look like. It's a podcast about podcasts. So it's kind of, there's only so many places you can go. For Next Level University, it's heart-driven but no BS holistic self-improvement for dream chasers. Very specific. Heart-driven but no BS means we're going to tell you the truth, but sometimes you might not like the truth. Holistic means life, love, health, and wealth. Self-improvement means getting better every day. For dream chasers, for people who aspire for different. Not for entrepreneurs, that would be a completely different podcast. Not for athletes, that would be a completely different podcast. For dream chasers is somebody who aspires for more. Doesn't mean you want to be an entrepreneur. Doesn't mean you want to be a gazillionaire. Doesn't mean you want to be a professional athlete. It means you want more than you have today. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Relationship-ally. But every episode we do is kind of run through that filter. So that is always an exercise worth doing. Always, always. And it's an exercise worth redoing because it's very easy to lose sight of what your niche is. So that helps you figure out your niche.
Hey Kevin, Kim here. Just wanted to send you a video to say thank you so much for your help on creating the Peaceful Productivity Podcast. You know, I couldn't have done it without you. I knew you'd be lots of great help with the technical aspects of getting the podcast going, but you went well above and beyond that. You helped me with the strategy and you gave me all kinds of really great support. You know, I think the key to success in business is a great attitude, and you have that in spades. You really walk the walk. So thanks again. Take care. I'll talk to you soon.
Your audience, this is where it can be hard, because if you start a podcast on something that you're just newly passionate about, your audience is most likely going to be you 5 years ago, or you when you were initially introduced to what you're talking about. If you have a mindset podcast and you've only been learning about mindset for 2 years, your audience is probably going to be you 2 years ago. Because you're not going to have people who have been studying mindset for 15 years listening necessarily. It makes sense, right? It's just the hierarchy of understanding. If you're a world-class coach who is just starting a podcast, but you have 15 years of experience in coaching, you're going to have a different audience than somebody who's just starting. So if I could add any value on knowing your audience, if you have no idea who your audience is, It's probably going to be you at an earlier point in time. If you're starting a show and you want to design your audience, your content is going to dictate who listens. So your niching, I think it goes one of two ways. Your niching either becomes a result of audience understanding, or your audience understanding is a result of your niching. If you niche early, from the very beginning, you probably have a good idea of who's listening to your podcast, because they wouldn't listen if they weren't into what you talk about. If you've been running your podcast for a while and you don't really have a niche, your audience is going to dictate what your niche is. But that's going to require you to have one-on-one conversations with them to figure out who they are. And that's the hard thing. And then if you're starting a podcast, let's say you have a brand new podcast, step one, or one way, I guess, is just talk about whatever you want and see who is attracted to it. Step two is talk about a specific topic, knowing a certain type of person is going to listen to it. I think number two is the way to go. Because it's getting harder and harder and harder to get the audience to self-identify. So if you just talk about whatever you want to talk about and attract who you should, I don't know if that's good advice anymore. Because what you want to talk about might be all over the place. And I just imagine it's going to be really, really hard to grow that. It's going to be really hard to get people to self-identify. So I know I'm all over the place in this episode because there's so much to this. It's not just pick your niche and know your audience. There's so much that's under it because everything else we do is based on these two things. What are the words that are used in the titles of your niche? What does your audience resonate with? What type of guests would speak to your niche? What type of guests would your audience resonate with? These are the two pillars, but there are so many things that go into this. And you can make your life easier by picking your niche because then you have an assumption of who's listening. Most people listening to this podcast are either podcasters or those who aspire to have a podcast, right? I don't expect any athletes to listen. I don't expect anybody who's in a sales position to listen. I don't expect anybody who is into self-improvement to listen. If they do, it's because they have a podcast that's about that. So my niche dictates the audience. When sometimes if you start something, the audience kind of dictates the niche. That's all I really wanted to make the point of there. So this client made money through coaching in the first week of her podcast. How? Very aligned calls to action. A very aligned calls to action. She knew the right words to use in order to get her audience to take the next step. And she is very good at what she does. Obviously, that's important. Obviously, that's important. But she would never be as good at what she does if she didn't know her audience that well. That is the through line of it. The through line is, what if I'm making a Mexican restaurant, I want to know what the consumer, what the customer is looking for. Why would they choose my restaurant over Taco Bell or any other Mexican restaurant? Taco Bell is not a Mexican restaurant. I think they consider themselves a Mexican-inspired restaurant. So even they don't put themselves in it. But think about that. Taco Bell, one of the biggest taco restaurants on the planet, is not niched as a Mexican restaurant because they know that's not what they are. They can't compete with real, authentic mom-and-pop Mexican restaurants. That's not how they win. That's just not how they win. Their audience is different. I love Taco Bell. Probably because I'm very low maintenance. But I've gone to real Mexican restaurants where the food is just amazing. It's so much better than Taco Bell. But I don't necessarily want to pay for it, or I don't want to sit down and eat it, or whatever it is, right? I don't know how we evolved to Taco Bell in this episode. But that's really what this client has. This client has a very hyper-specific niche. That's part one. Part two is they know their audience really, really, really well. And part three is they have expertise in it, right? I'm not going to leave that out because that's obviously super important. but they got that expertise because they knew the niche that they were in and they knew their audience. So one of the things that is beneficial is to, I guess, one of two ways. Based on your current podcast, who do you think listens to the show? And when I say that, I'm talking about we're making an avatar. We're going to name this person. We're going to get a picture of this person. How old are they? How much money do they make? Are they single, married, whatever? How often do they exercise? What are brands that they like? What are TV shows that they like? That is the level of work that I think is just super valuable. We did that in the beginning. We went through all of it. We would have a picture of somebody up when we were doing episodes. This is our avatar. So you can ask yourself, what type of avatar do I currently have based on my guess or based on the conversations that I've had? Or what is the kind of avatar that I want to create? I want to create an avatar of podcasters. And honestly, maybe the avatar is getting even smaller where it's podcasters who want to coach. That's not my goal. I don't want that. But I do talk a lot about coaching. And if you're somebody who is a podcaster who is a coach, you're probably going to resonate more with me than somebody who isn't a coach. There will always be value regardless. That's always my goal. But maybe that's the avatar that is clearer now based on 115 episodes. But when I was doing this, I was thinking of, I want to help a podcaster who is new, who will come listen to the podcast based on the fact that it's easy enough to understand, but also they'll follow along when I go super deep because they'll need to know that eventually. They believe they'll need to know that eventually. They believe it will be valuable eventually. That is my niche. My niche is somebody who has a ton of experience in podcasting, but also now in business, also now in speaking, also now in coaching, also now in leadership. It's not just podcasting. It's kind of a holistic approach to podcasting. You can imagine the audience that I'm going to attract. Okay? So I guess if we were going to have homework, if we were going to do a little homework assignment, which was always my least favorite part of school, I didn't like school at all, and I hated homework even more, it would be revisiting top 25 to 50 problems, top 25 to 50 problems that those problems create, 10-word description of the podcast, and probably creating a very, very, very specific high-quality avatar of who do you want to listen to the show and who do you think is listening to the show. Hopefully those are the same. If you haven't started a podcast yet, I would say, who do you want to listen to the show? Because that's where you're starting. Nobody's listening yet. If you have a podcast, who do you want to listen and who do you think is listening? And the ultimate goal is, how do we make those become more synonymous? How do they become closer to the same audience? Is the result that this client got typical? No. No, I'm not saying that that's going to happen. I'm not saying that if you have these two things in alignment and you know you're going to make money right away, I'm not saying that. And I don't want you to think I am. I don't want you to think I am. That's why I didn't put the only two things that my client needed to monetize her podcast in the first week. These things helped. They helped our client monetize her podcast in her first week. They helped. But she is really good at what she does. She's really smart. She's done years of research, right? There's a lot of, she's super consistent. She shows up. She doesn't miss. She's very consistent. So those all are there too. Honestly, the thing that maybe the better frame of this is two things that if you get wrong, you'll most likely never win with your podcast. If you don't know your audience and you don't know your niche, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. Because even if you do want to go the sponsorship ad route, if you don't know your audience, you don't know what sponsorships and ads are actually going to work. And I went to a webinar recently. I think it was hosted by Sounds Profitable, which is a company that does a lot of research on demographics and user data and stuff like that. And they talked to 5,500 people, and we're getting data from that. And I think it was 15% of people stopped listening to podcasts because of ads in general. They just didn't resonate with the ads. So out of the people that stopped listening to podcasts, 15% of which said somewhere that ads were one of the reasons I stopped. And I'm willing to bet it was probably because some of those ads were misaligned. I was listening to or watching a YouTube video the other day that was about technology. And I think the ad that they had was for a VPN, a virtual private network, which is very in alignment. If you're watching technology, a channel about technology on YouTube, you probably understand what a VPN is, and you probably know whether or not you need one. Makes sense. If you have a brand that is about running, it would make sense to have an Oura Ring or the Whoop app or something that helps you with your sleep or something that helps you with your hydration. That would make sense. It wouldn't make sense to have chewing tobacco or whatever the tobacco pouch is. Probably wouldn't make sense. It's a self-improvement health podcast, not that. If you have a bar stool type podcast, alcohol, liquor, nicotine stuff, that type of stuff, that will work because your audience is more likely to resonate with that stuff. And again, nothing against that. I'm just saying. So that's kind of my deeper messaging on this is it's not just about knowing your audience so you can title the podcast and get the right guests on. If you do want to monetize, knowing your audience is going to dictate how much you charge for coaching or courses or whatever it is. If you're going to do ads, sponsors, affiliates, it's going to dictate which ones you do. It's going to dictate all of that stuff. Does your audience resonate with doing live in-person stuff? No. Oh, okay. Is your audience somebody who is super confident and would love to come to something in person? Oh, okay. That's good to know, right? So it's not just the top of the business. This goes through the entire business. And at this stage, one of the biggest issues I've seen with podcasters is these two things. They don't have a niche, even if they're 100 episodes in, and they have no idea who their audience is. And it's very hard to win without those two things. So that is my final take on that. If you need help with this, if you do not know what niche you're in or what niche you want to be in, and you don't know who your audience is, and you need help, I don't want to say rebranding, but realigning, that tends to be something that I'm pretty good at. I don't know why. I think it's just experience doing this for a long time. But that is something I've helped a lot of people do. This starts with a name. Some people have come to me and said, I have this idea for a podcast. This is who I want the audience to be. What do I name it? And I'll literally help them name it and come up with a 10-word description. So my link will be in the show notes, as always, for a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session. I know maybe it seems intimidating, or maybe, I don't know, maybe you think I'm going to sell you something. I'm not. I'm going to just try to add as much value as humanly possible. Have a moment of courage and book that dang thing, because, yeah, you might learn something that you can take with you forever. That's the ultimate goal, right? And my goal as a podcaster is to be the podcaster that I needed. If I had someone who could help me skip steps, or at least make those steps a little bit easier, avoid the pitfalls that I fell into, that's one of the reasons I started this in the first place. So that will be in there as always. I hope that you are really starting to understand who's listening to the podcast. I hope you're reviewing your episodes, because that's always, it sucks if you don't like the sound of your voice, which nobody really does in the beginning, so you're not alone on that. But you learn so many lessons by doing that. So I hope you're doing that. I hope you know your niche. I hope you know your audience. I hope you believe in what you're doing. I hope you believe it will be worth it to keep going, because if you do it right, it can. I won't guarantee that it will. You're going to learn lessons no matter what, though. So from that perspective, it's always worth it. And I hope you enjoyed the episodes with Evan. Evan is a friend now, which is very, very strange. And all of the opportunity that I got going and speaking in Toronto and speaking virtually to Evan's group, that all came from him coming on our podcast. And now he's a guest on a podcast about podcasting. And he had some nice things to say about me, which was very weird. So I hope you enjoy that episode. I am looking forward to doing more guest interviews. I have some ideas. I just don't know how to go about them yet, but there are some irons in the fire. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. As always, keep on crushing it. Keep on podcasting, and I will talk to you all next week.